Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Resourceful Materials stage for the final session of the final day of Future Build. Thank you all for coming along. We've got a really, really good panel. I'm David Greenfield. I'm your chair for this afternoon. One of the co-curators with Duncan, who's hopefully getting some sandwiches somewhere. We're going to have a really interesting discussion this afternoon. And as I said, we've got some brilliant speakers. I do have one announcement that Cecile von Oppen, unfortunately, is unable to make it. So from that perspective, I'm going to be doing a presentation instead, just to fill the gap. She apologizes, and that does mean that we've got a full male panel, which I also apologize for. Sorry, but at least I'm acknowledging it, or is that any good? Anyway, what we're going to do is kick off straight away with a speaker who some of you will know, who's going to give us a really interesting perspective into Fab City. James, over to you. Go on there if you want.
So can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay, so as David said, my name's James Tooze. I'm the head of product design at the University of Brighton. And I'll kind of talk a little bit about me and a little bit about the initiative that I'm involved in. So this talk is called SNAFU to Fab City. So for those of you who don't know, SNAFU means situation, normal, all fouled up. So I'm going to talk about three things. So, sorry, you wanted a picture. So why are things a mess? How do we explore new normals, and what is the Fab City initiative, and how does that connect to the first two? So I chose a single material as an illustration. So this is a material that's used within the construction sector, the DIY sector. It's used to stick one thing to another. What I'm using this for as a representation of is the madness of material use, and also the madness around disclosure. So what we know about materials, both in terms of specifying them, knowing how to use them, what to use them for, and the kinds of information you're provided with. So there's a couple of key points from using this particular material, which is don't put it into drains, it's hazardous to aquatic life. It has some persistence and degradability, but the information isn't disclosed. And there's a bioaccumulative potential, or at least there might be, but within the material safety data sheet, it's just not provided. The irony, in the same data sheet, they tell you if you get it on your hands or on your clothes, you should wash it off with water, which is a direct way to put it into bodies of water, which will have the effect that will be significantly harmful. So what I want to do is I want to illustrate the fact that this is being produced on an industrial scale, and it's being disseminated and distributed on an industrial scale. It's going into retail stores, it's going into the homes and buildings that we occupy, and its use is incredibly short term. And naturally, I think you'll find that this material finds its way into the kinds of habitats where it will have a disruptive effect. Well, that's normal. What's also normal is that the stuff around us is made up of lots of different materials and material amalgamations we don't really know much about. We don't really inquire about quite often. We ignore it. We're surrounded by this information that is just overwhelming. You know, whether it's in the things that we wear, the things that we carry, or it's in the fabric of the world that we occupy. But this is the situation, it's normal, and it's really fucked up. So what we need is alternative norms. So what I do as a design educator is I work with students at both master's and undergrad level to work out what they can do. One of the challenges of that is they've got very little agency. They don't know very much in terms of what is possible and what's not, what's going on in the world, in terms of policy, infrastructure, economics. So what they're doing is that they're exploring it from a position of naivety. But there's a power in that. So as a quick illustration, the things that I do, so I was at the Royal College of Art for 5 years, and I ran a studio there that's evolved to become a master's program at the Institute of Advanced Architecture in Catalonia. I've just moved to Brighton University, where I'm trying to take the initiatives that I've been working on for the last 5 or so years, including research into distributed manufacturing, circular economy, openly available material data. These things kind of weave together in the work that I do and what I do with my students. So some of my students, so Ambra, Ewan and Raf, have been working in Oak Park and thinking about what the relationship between the development of that area, so 35,000 new homes, and what's already there, so UK's largest industrial centre. So how do you calibrate material waste, material use, productivity, and the need for things in that area? How do you do it at a local level? That's one of the things they're thinking about materially and in terms of skill and need. I mean, these aren't solutions. What they are is kind of provocations. They're ways of exploring what's normal, what could be normal. Or a project like Jack's, that he saw the massive problems around composite board use within electronics, and the fact that these things don't necessarily allow for the componentry to be recaptured at the highest possible utility. So what he did was develop a substrate that you can put into boiling water, and that will then sort of come apart and then relinquish the components. So how do you design in and through materials ways of recapturing other materials of value? Or projects such as Eddie's project, where he was looking at lending libraries and how you increase the value of an object through your material selection. So making things last a long time and connecting them to the kind of service models of use that could lower material impacts. Or as one of my current students, Ewan's thinking about a logistics model where people who make things locally can find access to materials that are being wasted by coffee shops and whatnot. You know, like, how do you connect the people that are creating waste with the people that could be making things in a way which is not large scale, is kind of piecemeal, but could, through a kind of cumulative effects, have significant impacts. But this also connects to projects that are ongoing, that kind of come out of or are connected to the teaching that I do. So Liz Corbin, who was one of the founders of Materium, and I taught together at the Royal College of Art. And this is one of the projects that she's founded, which helps students and other people find natural recipes for materials, and making that openly accessible for people to work out how you do things in a low impact way. Or it's projects like Precious Plastics. This is thinking about how you make infrastructure available. These things can all be challenged as their veracity or their potential for change, but they're all kind of seeds of a kind of collective and open response to the kind of challenges around material use. 2 minutes, I've got a lot to say. Also, this connects to the evolution of industry through digital production, projects like WikiHouse, which is thinking about how communities build, or MakeWorks, which is about making production centres visible so that we can access people who make things near us. And this all kind of connects together to a project I'm involved in called Fab City, which I've now got a minute to talk about. Okay. So Fab City is born out of the Fab Lab movement, this idea that you have a place that can make almost anything. And what Fab City is an imagining of a city where you can make almost anything. It's not necessarily a city of Fab Labs. What it is knowledge of materials, knowledge of processes, infrastructure, culture, economics, that together create cities that are resilient and self-sustaining. So this is sort of being tested through a series of prototypes. There's a significant one in Barcelona, where they're sort of connecting a number of initiatives, and through the Institute of Advanced Architecture kind of catalysing these through their students. It's through getting civic signatories. So we now have nearly 40 partners within the Fab City network: Paris, Mexico City, Detroit, Shenzhen, etc. And it's about trying to get cities on board and connect to designers, makers, thought leaders within cities to catalyze things and to connect one city to another. So as you can see, we've got cities growing, and or the number of cities are growing. We're hoping to get more on board this year. And through that, we're doing prototypes. So that's me in the top corner, as part of a prototype with IKEA and Space 10 in Barcelona a couple of years ago. We run these kind of summits every 2 years. So this is the summit in Amsterdam. This is the one in Paris. There's again one in Montreal in this summer where we'll get more cities signing up. And hopefully we're going to have Brighton sign up, and they'll be part of a network. And the real power of this network is that whatever happens in this city, any successes or failures or any learning that we get, we have this network of cities that we can share things with and replicate and parameterize. So if any of you are interested in this, I imagine you live in a particular place. So if you're living in that place, can you be doing something through a network like this to try and make connections with the people doing things in your local area? And how do we do that as designers, makers, or policy makers? So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Really, really fascinating, and we'll pick up some questions around that in a second. I think one of the key things is normal, we need to reevaluate. Okay, our second presenter is Martin Gettings from the Canary Wharf Group. And Martin is going to talk to us about some of the great work that Canary Wharf has been doing and how he's been leading that. Martin, over to you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to predictably come at this from a slightly different angle. I think what we've heard a lot about today is the stuff that goes into cities, the things that help us live our lives. But how much have we talked about the actual fabric of the cities? That's what I'm going to focus on today. I think a circular city is less about creation of perfect closed loops, but more about shifting the mindset of an economy. And that's the kind of focus of where I'd like us to come from. So love it or hate it, the Canary Wharf story is a successful story. And its success really is down to brilliant future thinking and master planning, right? Here we see the original ground plan for Canary Wharf. It hasn't really changed much in the last 30 years. And it's a testament to that original plan that you can see the similarities. The principles of citywide circularity were very much at play right at the start, although they might have not been called circular. They might have been called something else, perhaps future-proof. And, you know, the fact that what's behind the scenes, what's unseen, there was as much thought put into that as what there was the front of house. So roads that never need to be dug up, infrastructure that's future-proofed. We can literally install all the modern services and systems in the existing infrastructure at Canary Wharf. You know, flexible shell and core that needs minimum intervention to take a whole range of different use cases. That was the thinking 30 years ago, and that's our commercial model. We're able to use buildings time and time again with just light internal remodels. In One Canada Square today, on the 50th floor, we're doing a fit-out for UCL, University of London. Who would have thought that you could get a university campus in One Canada Square? Because it has that flexibility, because we've invested in the shell and core, it literally lasts a lifetime, and remodeling of the city can be done at large scale. Where have we heard this before? We weren't the first to over-engineer the core. You know, the Victorians got it right, and maybe Canary Wharf got it right as well. So even then, back in the sort of in the mid '80s, when Canary Wharf was being conceived, we knew we were building for an unknown future, and I think that's something that we could learn from. You know, with the needs of climate resilience, what's the future going to be? What's the future buildings needs going to be? Is it going to be more residential and less commercial? Well, we think so. Now, of course, we can speak of some closed-loop elements. You know, you've heard me talking quite a bit about coffee cups and plastics. You know, perhaps even protection as a service, rethinking how we do things. I mean, I tell the tale about we took all of the plastic protection from one of our projects and sent it off to EcoBooth, and they converted it into boards, and there's probably some of the boards here today that used to be protection on our site. So we are doing the closed loop elements, but really, isn't it about scaling up our thinking? Isn't it about scaling up the thinking beyond just closed loop systems, and how can we make the fabric of an entire city a closed loop? So we've done some work at South Bank. We've done some work with our supply chain, Lang O'Rourke, McMullen Facades. And through digitization, modularization, designing for deconstruction, we're able to drastically improve the carbon, the waste, the material use of our components. But it's not just circular components. Isn't it about how we think of our buildings? I mentioned One Canada Square. I mean, we've recently signed the Architects Journal Retrofit First campaign. And it's something that we found it quite easy to sign, because we've kind of been doing that from the start. This internal shot here is 7 West Ferry Circus, one of the Phase 1 buildings from Canary Wharf, now totally remodelled and a really attractive, BREEAM excellent commercial offering. So recirculated buildings are perhaps the start of the thinking. The start of the thinking that the built environment, maybe we should be thinking about it differently. Maybe we should be thinking about the built environment as a service. And I'm just going to end on this slide here, because I don't think I've took me 10 minutes. I think I'm well early, but I just wanted to start the discussion. I think we need much more retrofit, much less demo. Perhaps we need to see ourselves no longer as developers, but more as zero carbon remodelers. And is that where the future goes? We have to bring all these elements together. It's not just thinking about circularity, it's also thinking about zero carbon, health and well-being, and all of the elements that go with that. We've got to start thinking holistically about our cities. Yes, it's about all the elements that go into our cities, but it's also about the fabric and the unseen elements that sit behind the scenes. So to enable a circular city, perhaps we need a new economy. Perhaps we need this different type of thinking. And I was delighted to see the marketing materials for Vertis, which is a new Canary Wharf Group company, one of the Canary Wharf Group family. And their catchphrase is lease it like you own it. Now, isn't that what we're all talking about? We're talking about residential here as a service, not as a property that we own, but something that we can buy into, an experiential thing that we can buy into for a short period of time and hand it back. Well, isn't that circularity? I think what we're faced with right now, not just with circularity and resources, there's a gap between what the scientists tell us is needed and what's economically possible. What do we see that gap? Do we see that gap as an obstacle and something that's a challenge, or do we see that as a business opportunity? And I would say that businesses who can work collaboratively, put themselves in that place and deliver solutions that meet the zero carbon trajectory that we need, that meet the needs of circularity, that's the place where we want to be. That's where we want to be differentiating and putting ourselves in that place. So we've just issued a full report. This is my shameless plug. Please go on canarywharf.com and take a look at our latest report, Future-Proofing London's Economy. It brings together all of those elements and tells the story of what the next 30 years might look like. I just want to end on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. Brilliant. We'll put the slides on to the next one. Right, the next speaker is myself, so I'm going to have to introduce myself while the slides are getting changed. Just for some of you who don't know me, I've got many different hats, but today I'm actually going to be talking about Brighton and Hove and some of the work that, just staying with that, some of the work that we've been doing down in Brighton to ensure that circular economy is delivered at a city scale level, not a big city, not a London, but at a local area. So a little bit about myself. I'm going to set my own timer. Thank you, Duncan. So, I run Sonex, co-founder, environmental research and innovation practice, and we do a lot of work in circular economy. We run things like Tech Take Back with CAT, a pop-up shop for end-of-life electricals. I run Pothole Spotter, the Remanufactory, and do a lot of data reporting. I'm also the European lead for something called the Circular Economy Club. If none of you have heard of the Circular Economy Club, please go onto the website. You can join for free. There's 20 Circular Economy Clubs across the UK and around 270 around the world. So it's a really big network of people, and it's about connecting and exchanging information and ideas. So I just want to talk to you about our challenge. It's not new. This is probably a nerdy quote from my perspective, in that this is something that was put out a little while ago by Theodore Roosevelt in 1907. It's not a new challenge. We've been talking about this ever since we crawled out of the swamps. Waste is something that we've always had to manage. Sometimes we've managed it very well, sometimes we haven't. We're now talking about resources. We're now talking about closing the loop. This has been done in the past. We need to learn. However, our challenge is significantly bigger. 70% of the world's population will be in cities in 30 years' time, if we haven't all died from coronavirus. And we need 300,000 new homes over the next, every year for the next 20 years. That is a huge amount of infrastructure. We're in a future build exhibition. 300,000 homes is a lot. And that's not including any of the infrastructure that sits alongside those homes. The challenge is also significantly more strategic. For me, this is probably one of the most important quotes that needs to be taken away. 80% of the environmental impact of anything that we do is designed in at the start. If you're coming to something and you want to try and retrofit it, you've missed a lot of the opportunity to embed or reduce carbon. We have to, with new stuff, understand the potential. This statistic still blows my mind. 75% of the infrastructure on this planet hasn't been built yet that will be here in 2050. Think of that. That's 3 times the amount of infrastructure that is currently on this planet hasn't been built. We saw with, I'm doing a lot about coronavirus. I'm a little bit worried. Maybe I've got it. No, we've seen that China has built a hospital in 10 days. The amount of building that is going on in Asia, in Africa, in South America is massive. We're a relatively small, landlocked country here with a lot of infrastructure already in place, not much scope for much more. The rest of the world is building and building and building. We need to consider that. And we need to consider it from this perspective. There's a lot of deniers out there. What are the benefits of everything we're talking about and what we've talked about on this stage for the last 3 days? Huge benefits. There's a lot of people saying, oh, it's a big hoax. Why change the world for a better place? We have to try and get everybody on board with this. And cities are one of the places that have done that. In the UK, 75% of cities have declared a climate emergency. 2 years ago, even a year ago, if you'd have put that slide up, nobody would have believed that. That is progress. But, and as somebody that's worked in the public sector for 20 years, just because they've signed up to a climate emergency doesn't mean they know how they can work and adapt and mitigate for a climate emergency. And this is where some of the solutions from today, but also from this whole exhibition, are absolutely critical. And I want to talk you through one particular city. I mentioned Brighton and Hove. We've been working with Brighton and Hove for a couple of years now, and they gave us their economic development strategy. And you're going, why talk about economic development? Sustainability, isn't it? Circular. We actually got into their economic development strategy a link to circularity. So there's an action that they have to create, a circular economy framework incorporating the Sustainable Development Goals to 2035 for priority sectors for Brighton Hove region. That is a really, really challenging ask. Duncan and I have been doing a huge amount of work with the officers, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. But we're looking at two sectors, the built environment. So this is a really good graphic from the World Green Building Council about how you can look at sustainable development goals and building solutions. I'd encourage you to look at that. It just gives a really simple overview of some of the actions that you can take when you're looking at retrofit, new build, etc. In Brighton, we've been embracing that, and our journey has been about getting champions and actually embedding knowledge. So I know quite a lot about this topic. I can go and speak to a number of officers in the City Council who will go, sorry, what's circular economy? And what we've done over the last 12 months is go from having a few champions who know it to having over 125 council officers now having gone through circular economy training to help them understand what circular economy is, how it relates to their role, and how they can use it in their day-to-day job. And we're doing that through exploring the built environment and the different interventions along the way. So one of the things I'm doing is I'm writing a book for the Institution of Civil Engineers called Infrastructure in a Circular Economy, and it's got 5 sections. And I'm going to talk you through the 5 sections because the 5 sections really do highlight the opportunities for circular economy. So in the design phase, we have a number of different opportunities. Martin's already mentioned design for disassembly, design for standardization, design for flexibility, design for natural materials. All of these things need to be considered for new builds, but also for retrofits. Manufacture and supply of materials phase. Understanding the materials you're using, the materials that are already there, the space that's there, looking at the lifespan, looking at the volatile organic compounds, looking at all of the different factors that go into the materials that you use so you can, again, inject circularity. At the construction phase, there's multiple different actions that you can undertake to explore and put in place circularity to deliver carbon reduction, to deliver waste reduction. We've got material sharing platforms talking in a minute. One of the biggest things that people can do to reduce carbon footprint, to make things more circular, is understand the use phase of that infrastructure. Most buildings have a design life of around 50 years. Most of them will have that. Tall office blocks sometimes have got a much shorter lifetime, but there's things that we can do like minimizing waste, increasing recycling, reducing energy, reducing water consumption, having much more flexible buildings. There's lots of opportunities, and this is what we're exploring with all of the officers to try and understand how they can build this into future developments. And then 5 years ago, this might have said demolition rather than end of life. End of life, second life phase. Infrastructure comes to the end of its life. What can we do with that? First thing is reuse it. If we can reuse a building from a carbon perspective, from a materials perspective, that is by far the best thing we can do. Deconstruct rather than demolish. Undertake pre-deconstruction audits. All these sorts of things are factors that we're now trying to incorporate into a city circular economy strategy. Now, if we can get all of this into the strategy, that will mean that the developers in the city have to take this into account when they're putting in new buildings. And we're not doing it with just the sustainability officers. We're doing it with the panoply of different local government officers. So we've had procurement officers, planners, housing officers, finance officers, business development officers, architects, all going through this training to try and help them understand what it means to them and how they can incorporate it into their day-to-day job. And we do that through a bit of a deep dive into what circular is, some exemplars from around the world. Most of them are Amsterdam. And then look at some of the opportunities locally. So we're taking big projects that have maybe stalled and just try and look at them through a circular economy lens. So look at the opportunities, the challenges, The capabilities within the councils. Many councils forget they've got brilliant staff in there and they forget to use them. What the offer is to the decision makers, and then actions and next steps. We've already had a few successes, and we haven't even written the strategy yet. So one of them is Madeira Terraces. Many of you will know that. It's on the seafront. It needs reconstructing. Duncan is being part of the design team to help incorporate circular economy thinking. The middle picture is Shelter Hall, a new development on the seafront modelled on Victorian architecture. We're working with the leaseholder to make sure that the fit-out is as circular as possible. So looking at, for example, leasing kitchens rather than purchasing. And of course, Duncan's probably told you about the School of Reconstruction. That's a partnership with the City Council to deconstruct an existing building, lay it out, understand what the materials are, and then look to reconstruct that material. And that's Duncan, Kat, and a number of others that will be working on that. If you haven't signed up to that, I think there's probably still spaces. So to conclude, for me, circular cities are about looking at the whole life perspective of the cities, the design, the material management, the construction, the use, and the end of life. And cities like Brighton and Hove and other cities have the opportunity to be the champions and the facilitators of long-term circular economy change and delivery. Thank you very much for listening. Right, I'll now introduce our next speaker. So, hopefully that was of interest. We'll have time for lots of questions in a minute. Our next speaker is Gerard Romers from Metabolic. Metabolic have been doing some very exciting work in one of my favorite topics, data. So, Gerard, over to you.
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah, great. Thank you. Delivering the circular economy at a citywide level, I'd like to take you through that, basically starting a bit more at a somewhat abstract level, maybe, but bear with me because I think it's interesting to see how we can go from our way of working as Metabolic, as an engineering and consulting firm, which is really rooted in systems thinking, to very practical examples of implementing circular economy on the ground. So I'm going to take you through that step by step through a couple of example projects. At Metabolic, our mission is to create a fundamentally sustainable economy as quick as possible. Because we really want structural change and lasting change, we feel that it's really important to think things through properly before we start to act. Even though there is a climate emergency and we have to move fast and we have maybe a decade, or maybe actually less probably, before we should really have our act together, we need to do it right because we can only do it once. So for us, systems thinking is a way to make sure that you really understand the complex dynamics of the system that you're trying to change, the urban economy and the city in this case. It gives you new insights in really the root causes behind, for example, these linear patterns in resource use. And it can help you identify interventions that can really trigger leverage points and change the system fundamentally and structurally in the long run. This way of thinking also avoids solving one problem but creating another, which is burden shifting in jargon. For example, you might create a completely circular building through reuse and recycling, but the energy that costs to start taking buildings apart, cutting out concrete floors and putting them back together in a different location might actually be worse than putting up a new concrete floor or using wood and not using concrete at all. So think about whether any of these types of shifts happen before you start diving into action and implementation. So at the city level, we've developed a methodology that uses this principle of systems thinking by really doing a thorough current state analysis, mapping all the resource flows in the city, for example, setting goals along not just material use, but also energy use, water use, social parameters, ecosystems, so a very holistic approach. And then moving into thinking about your interventions really carefully and moving towards implementation. And I want to just explain how that works in practice by taking one particular city, which we've been working for a while, which is the city of Rotterdam. In 2018, the city of Rotterdam asked us to, together with a host of partners, I have to add, develop a circularity strategy at the city level for them. And since then, the city has really developed as a circular frontrunner in the Netherlands, and they've moved from our strategy to an execution program. And I want to illustrate how we got to the strategy and how that led to actual projects on the ground. So the first step in our method is a really thorough analysis. Looking at the system for us starts at looking at the resource flows that go through it. So here you see what's called a Sankey diagram, which in the circular economy is a really common method of visualizing resource flows. On the left side, yeah, that's the left side for you. On the left side, you can see the incoming resource flows. You can see energy, food, building materials as well, the brown flows on the bottom. And it goes through the city, through different economic sectors, and then ends up in different destinations at end of life, being incinerated, landfilled, or hopefully recycled and reused. So this kind of gives you an overview. All of these flows are at scale, so the biggest flows jump out immediately in terms of mass and volume. For example, in the building flows, the brown ones, one of the biggest ones is concrete, of course. So you can immediately pick that out. But that's not where your analysis should stop, because this Sankey diagram gives you an idea of how the system works, what flows from where to where, and what drives those patterns. But of course, mass or volume is something else than impact. And ultimately what we want to do is reduce environmental impact. So the next step is to do an impact analysis based on this material flow chart and see which flows have the biggest impact and carbon behind them. You can see that in this graphic, for example, where the bigger the bubble, the more carbon dioxide is embedded in the production processes behind the material flows. And on the horizontal axis, there's land use, and on the axis in vertical, there's embodied water use. So this gives a quick overview of not just how big the resource flows are, but also whether they're impactful. And you can see a couple of resource flows diving up that weren't visible in the original Sankey diagram. So, does this work? Yeah. So, for example, over here you have two really tiny bubbles. One is concrete and one is steel. Just to stick with the example of the building sector, concrete was a really big flow and steel was barely visible in terms of volume, but actually the carbon dioxide embedded within the steel used in the building sector is as big as that of that whole mass of concrete that is being used, because the production process, of course, is much more energy intensive and carbon intensive. So this gives a different pair of glasses, a different perspective on where to start and what to change. From this analysis for Rotterdam, it became clear that 4 sectors really jump out. Agri-food, construction, consumer goods and healthcare would be the focus points for our analysis and for our strategy going further. And for those sectors, we also then started to do goal setting and vision development. Due to time, I don't want to go into it in too much detail, but the important thing is here that what we did in this first phase is really adding up the numbers and prioritizing based on impact and quantitative analysis. In this second part, we envision a new city together with the stakeholders, inhabitants, actors within it, and also link this perspective of a circular economy to context-specific problems. So, for example, a large share of the population in Rotterdam has a rather unhealthy diet and life pattern, so that's one of the key components of this vision, even if it doesn't come out in the material flows themselves per se. It's a city with a lot of blue-collar jobs that are actually reducing rapidly in the harbor, in the industry. So for them, a circular economy also is especially important because of the economic part and the jobs behind it. So whatever interventions we would come up with would also have to deal with that. And in this way, you start to add context and local characteristics to your analysis. Third step would be to start brainstorming about interventions for each of these sectors. And before we dove into that, we did a more detailed analysis on every one of these 4 economic sectors. So here you see a similar graphic again with the biggest material flows for the building sector in Rotterdam. And without going into all the details, the thing that jumped out to me when I did this research and made the visualization is that the volume of materials going out from demolition and renovation is almost as big as the volume of materials that is being used for new construction, and that rarely happens. If you take the average city in the Netherlands or Europe, I would wager, that's usually maybe 30–20%. And that's because the building stock in Rotterdam has been renewed, and it's at a point in its life cycle, it's been renewed right after the war, the city's bombarded, so quite a lot of buildings are now at the point where they are demolished and renovated. And this brings a lot of impact, of course, but also a big opportunity to change things. So from this detailed analysis, we started thinking through, 2 minutes, how can we start to intervene, looking at reduction, so making actually these buildings lifespan increase, for example. Synergy, if there is so much demolition waste, maybe of which a fraction can't be prevented, can we reuse that at high value? Procurement, all of these buildings are either renovated or demolished before new construction, so there's also a big opportunity for the government to have a say in how renovation or new build or demolition would take place in terms of tender guidelines, for example, and management. There's this really big churn of materials, 20,000 houses going to be demolished or renovated in the city in the coming decade. So how do you keep an eye out on those material flows and manage that whole process really well? Just to again repeat, this quantitative analysis is the starting point, and for us it's a good way to get to a long list of interventions, but getting to a set of interventions that's feasible and desirable within a certain context, like the city, it's also a process of engagement with all the local stakeholders. So we can come up with a lot of data and a lot of technical interventions and ideas, but to test them in the city itself and with the people that need to start executing them and supporting us in the implementation is key. From that process, I'll take one of the key interventions for the building sectors that came through and quickly illustrate how we moved on from that. So when talking to stakeholders, it became really clear that a central urban mining hub would be a really nice way to start interacting between the city government and different people in the construction sector. And there was a lot of support for this type of intervention. So this is one of the roads we choose for implementation, and we're at the moment involved in creating this building hub for reuse and recycling. I'll go quite quick because I'm aware of the time. To support the implementation of urban mining, so of reuse of materials from the built environment, Metabolic has built an urban mining tool, a model that can predict the type of materials, the mass, the value, the embodied impact in those materials that are present in the current building stock. That's important because if you build something new at the moment, of course you can create a really nice 3D model. Building information management software can really help you to store all that data. But that's not how we used to build them in the 60s and in the 70s. So we needed a way to find out what is actually in the buildings that are already there. We did that through getting data from building inspections for fire safety, for asbestos, for before they're resold again, you also have these. And with that we got empirical data for the older building stock in the city. And we could build a model by coupling the type of materials that's in different housing and utility buildings to public geospatial databases that actually show where all the buildings are in terms of their location and what their gross floor area is. And that gives you a first quantification and estimation of the type of materials and the amount that is present in the urban mine. You can do a static map with that. So here's an example from Amsterdam where we've mapped on the left side all the copper and or steel, sorry, and on the right side all the copper, the green, in different building stocks. But what's more interesting is to predict how supply and demand for circular building materials will develop over time. So with the city of Rotterdam, we listed all the known demolition projects. and there's a quite big data gap there. This is only the ones that they have actually handed out permits for, so we're working on expanding this sample. And we also listed all of the projects that we knew would happen in terms of new construction in the coming time. And from that, you can start picking the interesting projects. So we're still working on getting the overview complete, but even taking the top 10 of most voluminous and interesting demolition projects, we could start to trigger this whole ecosystem of companies around urban mining. Some of the largest projects already contain 2/3 of the material mass, so that's a really good starting point. And you don't need to wait for your model to be complete before you can start taking action and testing its utility in practice. We're not just talking about mass here. The model also has 150 building products like window sills or frames, steel beams, wooden beams, isolation, all of these different products, especially of the inner shells of the building, like you also showed, David, the ones with the shorter life cycle. We can also pull these out. And this is a really nice starting point for pulling in the market, because suppliers of building materials and also developers and contractors in using these again think much more on the product level. It doesn't really tell them much if there's a certain mass of concrete or a certain amount of tons of wood. But if I can tell them that there's window sills or beams or isolation or plating, then suddenly they can see if they can use that in their own business cases. And taking again the top 10 of the products from the top 10 of the projects, we only have 2% of the material mass left, but we still have 12% of the embedded carbon. So it's a really specific, pragmatic and practical way to start diving into a good climate strategy based on urban mining. And these products have a potential value, if you would buy them new, of around 25 million euros, so 21 million pounds roughly. And this is a nice way of getting from data to insight and implementation, because now we can trigger a lot of combinations of companies and, on the other hand, governments, where we say, okay, government, you have to coordinate around demolition and renovation to allow for a longer time period for careful dismantling of these buildings and getting the supplies up on the market. And on the other hand, the market has to also test financial feasibility and business sense in reusing these products. So this starts with quite a theoretical model. It's really a data-driven approach. But once you start to look at the particular context at which you apply that model and really work with a group of motivated partners to then take the insights from the model into practice, I think you can have a really powerful approach. And you can also be quite certain that what you do is something that in the long term will result in structural change, rather than kind of being pushed back in the system at a later point and putting a lot of effort and energy into maybe something that is less effective. Sorry for the small delay, and thank you.
Thank you, Gerard. I can't complain, I went over time. No, really interesting and really insightful, and something which I think will everybody will find very interesting. We'll discuss in a bit more detail later. So our final speaker of the Resourceful Materials stage for the end of 3 days is Christian Van Maren, who is the co-founder of the Excess Materials Exchange. Christian, would you like a... Yeah.
Can I get that mic? Thank you very much, David, and thanks for having the opportunity to close off this wonderful event. And what I'd like to share with you is a little bit of our journey of developing this sort of dating site for secondary materials and waste that we call the Excess Materials Exchange. And it actually is nice that I get the chance to close off, because it sort of builds on the stories that you've heard before me. So actually, we started this company about 3.5 years ago, roughly, and it began with the idea of having a sort of a simple, I don't know what you're going to call it, like a flat marketplace for secondary materials, something like eBay or something like that. What we found is actually, by talking to a lot of companies, that it's not something that they want or something that is usable at this stage of the transition, because of some of the reasons that were mentioned before me. But I just want to highlight some things is that, especially in construction, when something is being demolished or being deconstructed, a lot of materials are suddenly being sort of thrown into the market that then the market has to deal with. Leads to a lot of problems around quality, It's difficult to give guarantees on materials that have already seen some life. And it's difficult to predict what kind of life they still have and what kind of capacity they still have in their current function. Timing, obviously, when all of a sudden you're confronted with a demolition, the materials have to go somewhere, and that timing can be a little bit off. It's very rarely or almost never synchronized with something that's newly constructed or is going to be constructed, which I think should happen actually. It goes together with quantity. It's very difficult all of a sudden to deal with a large quantity of demolished or deconstructed materials. And then obviously also the location. So in that, after a lot of conversations with a couple of big companies, sort of helped us evolve the idea of moving away from a passive marketplace and becoming a dating site where we actively match the suppliers of excess materials, including waste, with the buyers, but also connecting them some what we call value-added providers. So all the companies and organizations you can imagine that are required to make transactions happen. So think of logistical service providers, tech providers, but also banks, insurance companies, legal firms, like all the organizations required to make transactions happen. And we did a pilot in 2018 where we worked with 11 big companies and organizations from different industries, and we looked at a wide range of materials, because actually one of the things that we like to sort of focus on is by connecting different industries and sectors with each other, because we find that most of the sort of high value matches come from connecting different industries and sectors together, because oftentimes when something has become waste in one industry, it's quite difficult to make it usable in that same industry again, whereas maybe with some small manipulations, you can use it in another sector or industry. So we've looked at things like ceiling tiles, railroad sleepers, railroad tracks, dynamic traffic signs, but also orange peels, rope, aluminum laminated packaging, floodlights, totaling about 70,000 tons that were released by these particular companies every year. And I just want to highlight a couple of examples that I really like. For all these materials, we looked for several matches. And so, for example, for railroad tracks, we found that already at a very small scale, they're being used as construction beams. And we found that it is possible to use discarded, mostly outdoor clothing or swimwear as feedstock for the carpet industry, because they use PA6 or PA6s, which can reuse again in their production processes. Then we found that there are companies that are turning railroad sleepers into wall elements, which actually they said was quite tough. They're not going to do that again. But one of the other more easier applications is turning them into anti-terrorism blocks, which for very unfortunate reasons are becoming more and more popular. But you can basically stack those sleepers 6 high, and then they become very useful as a barrier between pedestrians and cars, basically. And then obviously the highest value match that you can always find for a particular object is reusing it in the same function again. But I just want to zoom in on one example. So the railroad tracks, we explored a couple of options. So I mentioned the construction beams, also sound walls next to like highways, but also fencing. And these are all examples that we didn't necessarily think of, but people, actually mostly in the Netherlands, were looking into. Which is really interesting to see that that's already happening, and people are thinking about it and working on it. And maybe what they lacked, these particular companies and organizations, was the exposure to large volumes of materials that they could use. And this is sort of where we come into play. That's where our value comes from. At least that's our hypothesis or our hope. But anyway, we found that from these 3 particular options, the construction beam, from a financial but also from an environmental point of view, is the highest value match or the best match. And what we've done is, together with Ernst & Young, or EY as they like to be called these days, we made for all of those matches, but particularly maybe for this one, for the railroad tracks, looked at the environmental impact that you could save if you would use it again as a construction beam. And then we looked at 17 environmental indicators, which are very standard for LCA approaches, ranging from acidification, ozone depletion, but also I think finite resource use is in there, and then climate change, of course, as well. And then all these impacts are then expressed in a monetary sense, adding up to something that is called eco-cost, and that's basically the cost that you can potentially save future generations for cleaning up the mess that you would normally do today if you would stick to the status quo. Maybe a very simple way to explain it. And then we found that if you reuse the railroad tracks as construction beams, in the old situation, they would still. So what this shows is sort of the. This graph shows the comparison between the current end-of-life situation, the cost or benefits of that in a financial sense, the eco-cost in this bar, and then sort of the total cost. And we did that for the current end-of-life, and we found that most of the railroad tracks actually are sold on the international scrap metal market, and that means that they're mostly being sent to either Turkey or China, which already I think is kind of a waste because of all that heavy material being hauled all the way across the other side of the world. But I think also from a sort of resource independence point of view, Europe is losing all those very valuable materials, and then maybe from a geopolitical point of view leads to some interesting situations. So I feel like we should keep that stuff here. But then if you can, and because, so that gives them some money, so it gives them about 8,000 euros, I think it's per kilometer we calculated this. But then the eco cost of that is minus 14,000 euros, so that's then the environmental cost for future generations. And if you add those together, then the total sort of value for our client was minus 7,000 euros per kilometer of railroad track. But then if we were to sell it as construction beams, the value goes up to about 35,000 euros per kilometers. But also the environmental impact decreases significantly by about 2/3, because we still take into account that you have to melt it down at some point in its future life. So then actually the total cost goes way up, which is great, which our client also loved. And also really helped them, because we work mostly with the sustainability department within companies to convince their CFOs and their CEOs to make these sorts of decisions. And then if we zoom in on some of these eco costs, we try to express that in a sort of a meaningful way. It's a huge struggle, open for tips and feedback. But if we plotted a couple of interesting environmental indicators, so finite resource use, energy use, fresh water use, CO2 emissions, human toxicity, carcinogenic and non-carcinogenic, and fertile land use. And what you see in the orange line is the current end-of-life situation, and in the green line you see sort of the reduction that the potential high-value next-use situation has, so using it as a construction beam. And you see that overall the impact is very, very positive. It is also a logarithmic scale, so actually that 2 minutes, okay, is already quite significant. And so we've done that exercise for all those materials that we looked at, so all those 70,000 tons, and then we found that the financial value that we found was 64 million euros per year, but also the amount of energy that we can save with the matches that we identified. You could power the public lights in Paris for 5 years on, and the carbon emissions that we saved, you could drive around the world 23,000 times in an average 2017 car. And the water that you can save, you could fill 860 Olympic swimming pools with. So you can see that with a very limited amount of materials, the impact is quite significant. So what we learned from that pilot in 2018 is a couple of things. Is that it's really important that waste streams get an identity, so people know what it is, where it is, in what quality, etc. That we add intelligence to that we really turn data into usable information, and that's quite challenging. And that we use a very integral approach, because it's really important who you talk to in the organization, what you tell this particular individual, give them the right information to convince internal stakeholders to make better decisions. And that all combined is something that we now worked into our platform that we're going to release actually the next iteration of our software beginning of next month, which is the Resources Passport, giving waste streams an identity. And we also attach it to the physical asset using all sorts of tracking and tracing technology like barcodes, QR codes, RFID technology, you name it. Adding a very simple marketplace functionality to it because it's still necessary to show that stuff is happening and going on. But also, what we're building is a whole sort of semantic web of the circular economy. So what we do is when we log materials on our platform, and this is the example of an orange peel, we also describe its relations with its characteristics, with its functions, the processes it sees or can see, actors, sort of generic attributes, components. And by doing that, for lots and lots of materials, you sort of create this interwoven web that helps, once we are confronted with the material, to find high-value next uses for it very quickly and much easier. But also, if you turn it around, you can also help designers, architects, and people that are looking for secondary materials find materials faster. And this is an example for a windowsill, where over all these axes plotted all the available windowsills that we have, and it looks at all those windowsills like on length, height, like basic measurements, but also virgin material content, recycled material content, CO2 emissions, life cycle, and it really helps designers and developers find the materials that sort of fit their characteristics and help them hopefully source better, more sustainable secondary materials, hopefully from our database or from our clients. There's a couple of examples. And then what we're also working on right now, because we've looked at the environmental part, which is really important, but we also want to quantify the social impact. So we're now working with a consultancy firm from the Netherlands where we try to sort of, in the best way we can, quantify the social impact you can save. So we look at the safety of workers, or the sort of the health of workers, of the users, of small-scale entrepreneurs, and also of local communities, and then look at if they perform ideally, if they can still progress, or if there's no data or they're non-compliant. And then you can sort of create sort of a kind of like a hotspot analysis of where in the value chain the highest risk on certain unwanted scenarios is happening, like forced labor or child labor or any of those things, and give the right data to our clients to see, well, if we use secondary materials, we reduce the chances of those unwanted things happening in our value chain. And this is sort of fresh off the press, so we're still working on this, but it's really exciting, I think. And that helps us, I'm closing off, don't worry, to help our clients find the best sort of financial match, because that's still important, right? The best environmental match, but also fits within what we find socially acceptable. And for that, we need lots and lots of data to help raise our AI tools become better and better. So that's sort of my call to action to you guys, is that if you have, if you're looking for materials or you have materials, please come to us, approach us. We love data, and we want to help you find better matches for the materials that you have, but also help you find secondary materials for any projects that you may have and want to work on. Thank you.
Great. Have a seat. If I could ask the three of you to come up as well, that'd be great. I'm not going to be able to sit down and ask questions at the same time, so I'm going to stand. No, that's fine, Kat, that's fine. A really, really interesting and fascinating discussion, I think. Many factors of what make a circular city. We've talked about solutions. What I'd just like to dive into is some of the barriers that you found, because to get the solutions, we need to overcome some barriers. Martin, I want to start with you in terms of how do you get the right people in Canary Wharf bought into this? And have they been there all the time?
Yeah, I think that the answer, that the big barrier that we're faced with in all of this world of sustainability is the way things are done around here. This notion of culture. And I think if we can, I make the point that we have sort of 50-story towers, 40-story towers. We've got a 60-story residential tower, and a number of others going up at the moment. And I always make the point that the culture and the characteristics that got us to deliver that amazing place over the last 30 years is absolutely the culture and the characteristics that are going to take us forward to the next 30 years. So in terms of circularity and the way that we think about product and we think about materials and we think about, you know, the built environment that we live in, it's all about changing mindset. If we can find ways to tap into the competitive spirit, you know, the culture that wants to lead, if we can, as professionals, as sustainability ambassadors, if we can find a way to inspire that belief that this is a new currency, that this is a new value, that's how we can drive this forward. And that's kind of what we've sort of tapped into at Canary Wharf to take our sustainability and circularity story to the next level.
And is one of the barriers in that for others possibly financing it? How do we go about financing this?
Well, I think, you know, I absolutely agree. We find that also with the examples that we come across, often the barriers are more organizational than anything else, right? Technically, it's possible. Financially, it's doable or either at par with current solutions. But I think it would be helpful if the right behavior was, how do you say that, the companies would benefit from performing the right behavior.
Rewarded, yeah.
Because now we see that a lot of times, sometimes the circular solutions, at least at the beginning, require an upfront investment. And a lot of companies, when it comes to the desk of the CFO, are like, well, it adds more risk to our supply chain, and it adds more money. So why should we be doing this? Even though that the environmental benefits and the social benefits are enormous. So I think there is a lot of sort of space for improvement where maybe governments can step in, or some companies can show us some more leadership.
And I think that's an interesting one. Is it at a regional level, is it at a local level, or is it a national level that we have to adopt this? Gerard, I don't know if you want to, from the work that you've done with different cities and regions, what's the best place to target?
I think for me the most sensible skill to look at resource flows, not just like construction, demolition, but it kind of varies with the cycle that you're trying to close. So simple rule of thumb, the more complex the material and the more rare the material, the quicker you'd want to reintroduce it, because then you can use it again if it ever hits end of life. And also the more you can invest, on the other hand, in reintroducing it. So if you have your laptop, there's a lot of economies of scale perhaps in recycling that and reusing that in a really big factory for a larger area, if it comes to recycling. Of course, first you want to repair, refurbish, extend the life cycle, etc. But if you have resource flows that have very little financial value and are quite ubiquitous, like water or maybe solar energy or even food waste, and to a lesser extent building materials, it makes less economic but also less ecological sense to start dragging them across the globe. And then it's really sensible to say, okay, can I do that within this ecosystem called the city or a metropolitan region if you want, and can I close it there? So it depends on how rare and valuable and complex the material is in a way.
And I think probably just to add to that, and James, from your perspective as a designer, if you've got the opportunity for multiple materials, everything from bricks through to high-value construction materials through to some of the innards, how as a designer, and some of the work that you've done already with students, how can you actually, or what could you do with the information that's been presented so far?
It's actually quite difficult. Because it's sort of dependent on what challenge you're trying to face. It's also that despite the fact that there's an awful lot of data, we're quite information poor. So what I mean by that is if you're coming at this and you're thinking, okay, so I can see that there's this waste material that I can use. And if you're an individual designer or you're a sole trader, how is it you're going to get the expertise that you need to make the decisions to scale your idea up, or even to test whether it's suitable to scale up? So one of the projects that I'm working on is thinking about how we make common material data, safety data sheets, technical data. How is that open, cross-comparable, scrutable, like search in terms of semantic terms and go. So I want a substrate that is suitable for a table that I can use outside, that if it degrades, it's not going to pollute my garden. Can we search for materials in those terms? And it's how do you make, so one of the kind of things that I'm constantly thinking about. I used to be a furniture maker. I used to run my own company, so I understand the small scale. I understand not having any expertise and not having the financial backing. So how do you make circularity easy for people making those sorts of design decisions, whether it's individual objects or it's small scale design? I think that the second thing, just pick up on one of the other questions, is it's changing the structural factors around what is incentivized. So yes, by all means, companies have to navigate or negotiate their bottom line. Like, how are they going to make money doing things if it's circular, if it's got additional costs? But the government, or governments need to step in to create the right regulatory framework, the right incentives, the right limits to certain material use. They kind of need to change the rules of the game. If you want different outcomes, you've got to change the rule.
Absolutely. Okay, we're going to have some questions from yourselves. If you've got a question, please could you put your hand up and just introduce yourself briefly and a quick question. Everybody's being very shy. Question at the front. Thank you, Duncan. Our glamorous roving Mike.
Thank you. My name is Hrabina Nikolova. I'm Max Fordham, sustainability consultant. I have a question for the last speaker. How easy or difficult is it to link this sort of resources library to other tools, such as one click, for example, that calculate embodied carbon, so we as practitioners can start showing some positive stories.
Christian.
Yeah, and I think highly depends, unfortunately. But what we're working on is creating all sorts of APIs, sort of like little software tools that can help translate the data that we have with the tools of other relevant data out there. And if we find that certain tools are being used a lot, then we'll definitely take that into our development program to include those sorts of APIs and make it possible to communicate with other tools as well. Because I think one of the issues that we see currently in a transition is that there are lots of data islands created everywhere that maybe work fairly well on their own, but it would work a lot better if they would be able to sort of breach these boundaries, and we would open up all these little data islands and really create a much bigger system, because the more data you have, the better the matchmaking will be as well. So we're very open to looking into this particular tool. I don't know it actually, to be honest, but could look into it.
I think one of the really interesting things, and you've used the word, and we've used the word quite a few times already, which is data. We've got a lot of data, but what we haven't always got is enough information. And I think that's one of the barriers to the circular city, that actually the information that we require, in the same way James is saying, actually we want to look at it from his perspective, which is a use function rather than a material function. That transition between what a brick might be and what it could be used for is probably the important gap that we're not being able to identify at the moment. And for me, that's one of our real challenges. Martin, you want to add to that?
Yeah, just if I could add to that. I think one of the things that I'd like us to consider in all of this situation, you made the point that, it's just data driven, but that's brilliant. I actually got excited when you said that, and the presentation that you gave actually opened up the possibilities to what we can achieve with circularity in the built environment, and you were kind of almost apologetic about data. And I think what we've all got to start doing as professionals in the built environment is just demanding more from the built environment. This whole notion of value and what can be achieved, we've got to start seeing the new values in things. The fact that the built environment could be a brilliant, life-enriching place. But we don't. We go to the lowest common denominator every time. And I think through circularity, we have a way to really lift up the possibilities. It's brilliant because you can see the materials tangibly being reformed into other things. But why don't we just stop there? Why don't we start seeing the whole built environment in a different way? And I think that's what I'd like to try and promote. This notion that, the possibilities are there, but we've got to reframe it and think differently around it. And I think data, to pick up your point, is the way that will be enabled.
And you're entirely right. And as somebody who's also a data scientist, it's absolutely something that is necessary. We've still got huge gaps, we have got huge caps, but with the data we've got, we make as much information as possible. But also, I think one of the other key things, and it's been mentioned a couple of times, is how can we use the circular city from a social perspective? Because in a lot of cases, we just get focused on the bricks and mortar or the concrete and everything like that. How do we make it a space for the community? James, do you want to pick that up? And questions, by the way, if anybody wants to.
I think, well, okay, how do we, well, so I'm a maker, right? So I see the value in being able to make things, the agency that, you know, I have to look at material and think about what it could be and understand what tools I could use with it. I think that should be, this kind of making literacy should be something that we all have within school education, which should be embedded culturally so people can read buildings and we don't, so data, absolutely. I've got a kind of point to make about open data and non-hegemonic approaches to kind of data aggregation and the monopolization of that as a potential in the future. But in terms of response to your question, I think like cities would be the better if more people are engaged in making things in them and making the city rather than what they have become, which is a kind of destination point for goods and services produced elsewhere and a departure point for waste. You know, and I commend the rest of the panel in terms of the work that they're doing. You know, we are moving in the right direction, but there are some significant barriers. But culture is a definite part of that.
Gerard, do you want to add anything on data?
No, I was maybe we had questions.
Yeah, I was going to say, have we got any more questions? Question at the front. Duncan, if we could. Again, your name and...
Hi, my name is Joanna, Respace Project. Actually, question around the data and to be specific, artificial intelligence, because that is sort of coming as a future. And speaking about the data collection and designing those structures that sort of hold these sort of data banks and put them in use, how do you think that can accelerate the change once we marry that with the circular economy ethos within our workplaces, you know, construction, architecture, and so on and so on?
Christian, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, so we're now building a sort of a whole suite of artificial intelligence / machine learning tools to help us in mapping sort of the current built environment, but also into helping the tools understand, you know, what a chair is and what a table is and what it's made of. And I think what it will do is help us in an intelligent way look through all the databases that we have, but maybe also that other people might have, and in doing so, making better connections much faster. And oftentimes what we see with our tools, and they're still quite sort of immature, they need a lot more data to become mature and become more effective, is that already sometimes we see matches that we wouldn't have thought of, basically. And you know, a lot of times they are sort of worthless, but they're becoming better and better. And I think what we're trying to do now, which I think is very exciting, is as well to make the tools understand what functions are. Like for us humans, it's quite easy to see that, you know, a railroad track could possibly also bear some weight, but for an AI tool, this is almost impossible. But we're working with some other organizations that are looking at functionality from a more scientific point of view, and this is a super weird scientific field. Like the way that they describe the world is insane.
No, it's really interesting, and one of the projects I'm running is something called Pothole Spotter, and we use high-definition cameras on the front of bin lorries to take pictures of the road surface. Now, we need about 15 million images just to be able to make the computer understand what the difference between concrete and tarmac, and then different types of tarmac, and then identifying whether it's a crack or a line. And I think, for me, this is where ML and AI have got a huge part to play, but it does come back down to base data in many cases. What is the de minimis that we need to be able to get the computer to think and help us? And I think it's been talked around a lot, AI and ML in particular. We were having a conversation over lunch about AR as well, augmented reality, as a solution. We've got all of these tools that are coming through, that if we don't know how to use them properly, we might actually miss the opportunities. Gerard, do you...
Well, maybe to add, because this might also, there's also kind of a pragmatic or practical component to this, which is if you want to build these kinds of, you call it a semantic web with all these different functions, basically what you're doing, as far as I get it, but I'm not like into this field, is like you pull a lot of different variables and possible functions, and you all tie them to the same object or the same piece of data to be able to optimize between all of these and taking all of them into account. So it's really systems thinking at an insane level, maybe looking at 200 different possible burden shifts and trying to then find the best solution for it. So in that, artificial intelligence and machine learning is really interesting. But if you then think about how you would want to get that richer information about what can be used for what under which circumstances, then I think at this stage in the transition, there's also a very practical thing of, if I want to reuse something in the built environment and I want to figure out, and maybe just even keep it within that sector, and I say I want to harvest this wooden beam for my facade over here, can I do that? Quickest way for me to do it now is sit down with an architect who knows his stuff and then check out all the questions. That's fine for now, but I don't want to do that twice in my life ever. So if I do that, codify that knowledge and make sure that it ends up in the right platforms. I think that's the whole point, literally learning by doing. Don't wait until we have all of this somewhere stored in a relational database or a semantic web or what. But if you do this, make sure no one else has to ever do that again and pass it on. And I think that also resonates with what you mentioned for the Fab City network as well.
And I think maybe
share this stuff.
to sort of wrap that up, is like from a sort of a human point of view, what it does, it sort of cuts out all the boring stuff and allows us to become maybe more creative. I think maybe that is a...
We've got one more question, and then we're going to... Kat wants to ask a question, Duncan. And then we're going to wrap up.
I think it's really a question for Martin, and I was you obviously will be connected with other people in your role, and is there a lot of what you're doing going on around the UK in other cities? Like, are you hopeful about the changes that you're made are happening elsewhere?
Yeah, I think legislation is a great thing. Legislation is driving a lot of this, but legislation isn't enough. Legislation has to kind of be the starting point. We don't want to see other developers in other cities congratulating themselves because they're meeting legislation. That needs to be the launch pad to do even more. I think the consumer is becoming increasingly more and more enlightened and so woke on this whole issue. What I want to see are consumers selecting to go to a place because of its air quality, circularity, zero carbon credentials. Yes, the componentry, yes, the AI behind the scenes all has to work, but it has to be driven. The citizens, the people who occupy cities, thank goodness they're starting to demand more. We wouldn't be doing it. We wouldn't be driving our developments and promoting them in terms of sustainability if it wasn't being market-driven. But I still think there's more to be done. We've clearly got to get much further and faster on this whole agenda. So yes, to answer your question, other cities, other developers are doing it. We think we're leading the way, but of course there's other players in this arena. But yeah, I'm very hopeful.
And I think that's a really good note to end on, because from my perspective and the work that we're doing in Brighton and with other cities and with people on this panel, it's not about individually having siloed solutions. It's about connected and integrated system change. And the only way we can do that is to learn from each other. Many of you who've heard me will know that I use the phrase plagiarism plus. We have to add value to what's already been done. There's no point reinventing the wheel. And there's a number of different networks that allow people to share information. One of the pieces of work that we're doing, and I'll be coming to everybody on the panel later, for Brighton, what we're going to be doing is creating a circular economy route map that will be template that any other city in the world can pick up and use as a starting point to create their own route map or own strategy. And for me, that's where we're going with the circular economy. A circular city isn't about an individual city. It's a network of cities that learn from each other, supported by good data, supported by good information, and with innovation at the core of it. So thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to thank the panel in the usual way. Stay there for a second. As your chair for this afternoon, I just have to say a big thank you to you for listening. And I just want to bring up the curator of the Resourceful Materials stage, who's been here for the whole 3 days. And we'd just like to say a few final words and to say, on behalf of everybody who's been here, Duncan, thank you very much for everything you've done.
Thank you. I will be brief because I'm exhausted, but I just wanted to thank everybody who's not here today, who's contributed over the last 3 days. And these guys are amazing. I left them to the last session yesterday and today because these are the people really doing it. You've heard them for the last hour or so. Put that within the context of so-called innovators like Apple, who said 2 weeks ago, the problem with reuse and recycling is it will stifle innovation. It will stifle them maybe, but it is the way forward. It's been such an inspiration to curate this. It's been really easy because there's a lot of really amazing things going on. Thank you for your time, and I hope we see you next year. Goodbye.